Lo tikach livni mi bnos haknaani asher ani yoshev b'kirbo. An instruction given by Avram Avinu in one of the final episodes of his life, in this week's Parshat Chayei-Sarah, to his servant Eliezer, telling him under no circumstances should he allow Yitzchak to marry a wife from the local Canaanite families where he was living at the time in Eretz Canaan. Okay, so where should he go? Where's he going to find a wife for Yitzchak? Yitzchak at this point is 40 years old, and he needs to get married. In fact, the whole of the Jewish people is going to come through Yitzchak. So how are we going to solve this problem? And there's another difficulty here, which Rashi brings down in next week's Parsha, and that is because Yitzchak had been through the Akedah, the experience of the Akedah had given him a certain Kedusha, a certain personal holiness, which meant that he was never allowed to leave the land of Israel. Both Avram and Yaakov left the land of Israel for extended periods, but Yitzchak was not allowed to do so. And Avram says to Eliezer, under no circumstances may Yitzchak marry a girl from Canaan. What should he do? That Eliezer should go back to Avram's birthplace in Aram Naharaim in Mesopotamia, and from there find a wife. And that's how Rivka Imenu, one of the matriarchs of the Jewish people, enters the Jewish family. Now this chapter, chapter 24, is a massive chapter of 67 psukim, giving us a highly detailed account of this particular episode. But there's one fundamental question which is asked here by the commentaries that I find interesting. And that is, granted that Avram didn't want Yitzchak to marry a girl from Canaan because the Canaanites were all pagans. Don't forget, Avram Avinu was Avram HaIvri. He was swimming against the tide. He was surrounded by a pagan, idolatrous culture. He didn't want a girl from such a society. So what was he saying to Eliezer? Go back to Aram Naharaim, from his parents' home. But wait a minute, Avram himself has just done a lech lecha. He has left all that behind. Why did he leave it all behind? Because they were also pagans. Because his family were over the Avodah Zarah. We say this in the Haggadah. We speak about Avraham Avinu coming from Terach, who was over the Avodah Zarah. So in short, what was Avram hoping to find in the house of his family, which he couldn't find in Canaan? What was the advantage of getting a girl from Aram Naharaim over a Canaanite girl, such that this particular episode was so vital and so important that he had to make Eliezer swear that he would never take a Canaanite girl and dafka go out there? What is this? So I want to give you three different answers to this question. Each of them takes us a little bit deeper into the story in a very interesting way. The first answer is that of the Kli Yakar. The Kli Yakar explains that Yitzchak is not allowed to leave the country because of his Kedusha, but Avram is concerned because anybody who Yitzchak marries is clearly going to come from an idolatrous pagan family. But the problem is that if she lives in the vicinity of her own family, it'll be difficult for Yitzchak to, so to speak, re-educate her into a life of emunah, a life of chesed, a life of avodat Hashem, which was vital. And therefore, it was important that he would find a wife who wouldn't live close to her own family, and Yitzchak would be able then, in a sense, to reform and re-educate her to be a suitable partner in life and a soulmate for him. So therefore, a wife had to be brought from far away. So this first answer is interesting from the Kli Yakar, but it doesn't yet explain really why dafka from Aram Naharaim. The second answer is also interesting, which is that Avram Avinu has been told, "V'nosati luchos kol eretz Canaan la'achuzat olam." He'd been promised in Parshat Lech Lecha that the whole of the land of Canaan will one day become an eternal possession of his descendants. Therefore, he imagined that at some point in the future, the Jewish people would have to conquer and settle the land of Canaan and transform it, as they did in the days of Yoshua, from Eretz Canaan into Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, Avram reckoned to himself, if we marry into the families of Canaan, that will become very difficult, because they will then claim that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are also their descendants and that they have a claim to the land. So in order to make sure that the way of gaining possession of Eretz Yisrael would be done smoothly, he made sure that the future wife of Yitzchak was not from Benot Canaan. So, but these two reasons, again, both of them, explain why Avram didn't want Benot Canaan, but don't explain why Dafka he wanted them to go back to his family home. Until you get to the Rabbeinu Nissim. Rabbeinu Nissim was the 14th century, one of the great 14th century Rishonim in the golden age of Spain. And he wrote a sefer called Droshes Horan, in which he deals with some very fundamental issues in understanding the Tanakh and Halacha, and this is one of them. And he says very briefly that, of course, anybody Yitzchak married, he would have to deal with the fact that they had grown up in an idolatrous context. But there's another aspect to this, and that is that there's idolatry and there's idolatry. Not all of it is comparable. In what sense? That the Bnei Canaan were not only idolatrous, but they had a type of pagan practice which encouraged them into a life of promiscuity, a life of violence, a life of vengeance, a life of hatred. Their culture was driven by hatred. There are in this world certain cultures driven primarily by hatred. And instead of being driven by chesed and rachamim and tzedakah, they're driven by violence and vengeance. And these are not, if you like, hashkafa issues. These aren't issues of the mind. These are issues of the heart. These are midas. These are personal characteristics which are inherited genetically. That if you grow up and you inherit genetically these violent genes, you have a tendency in that direction. And therefore, Avram knew, of course, that his own family were indeed idolatrous, but he knew they were Ba'alei Chesed. They were people of hospitality and generosity, and they were not people who were violent and cruel. And indeed, Eliezer, when he looks for the girl, the way he tests her is a test of chesed. Will you help me give water to my camels? And she says, yes, I'll give you water. The test of Rivka was a test of chesed. Why is that? Because of this idea, says the Rabbeinu Nissim, and this is picked up beautifully by the Malbim as well. He quotes the Droshes Horan, and this is the real understanding of this whole chapter 24, that we're talking about finding a girl who, of course, grew up surrounded by idolatry, but had natural qualities of chesed, of generosity, of giving, of helpfulness, of sensitivity, and not of cruelty and violence. And that's really what he was looking for. He was looking for, in a word, the bein odom lechaveiro, the aspect of how people relate to other people in kindness and sensitivity, even though he knew that the bein odom lemokim wasn't there. And this is, I think, the key to understanding the whole chapter. And Rivka was chosen, if you like, on that, with those criteria. And this brings me to another very interesting detail in the story. Because in the story, in Pasuk 22, the Pasuk there says that when Eliezer meets Rivka for the first time, he gives her a gift. And the Torah unusually goes into some detail about this gift, seemingly quite unnecessarily. The Torah could have simply said, he gave her a gift. Instead of which it says, he gave her nezem zohov beka mishkolo, a nose ring of gold which weighed 1 beka, and ushnei tzemidim al yodeha, asoro zohov mishkolo, and 2 bracelets on her hand, which together weighed 10 units of gold. Why do we need to know this? And what is being said here? And in addition to which, I'd like to add that presumably, don't forget, all the stories of the Torah only take very select details out of the events. We're not told, I don't know, what day of the week it is, whether the sun was shining, what sort of clothes people were wearing. There are a million details we're not told. It's a bit like a short story. And so if a particular detail does come out in sharp focus. The question is, why would the Torah tell us exactly the nature of these gifts and the jewelry and how much it weighed? And Rashi gives us already an understanding of what the symbolic value of this is. Rashi says, Beka, remez l'shkolim, Beka la Gulgoles. It is a remez to later on, when the Jewish people are counted, they each give a chatzi shekel. And the chatzi shekel is called a Beka, Bet Kuf Ayin. Beka la Gulgoles. And this is a remez to the chatzi shekel. And what about the Shnei Tzimidim? Says Rashi, Shnei Tzimidim, remez l'shnei luchot mutzumadot. That there were two luchos habris. When Moshe Rabbeinu brought down the tablets, there were two of them, and they were joined together. So this is tzamud, two bracelets which were tzamud connected to each other. And why asara zohov? Because remez la'aseres hadibros. Okay. So the bracelets were a remez, were a symbolic reference to the future giving of the Torah, two luchos of the Ten Commandments, and the Beka Mishkan. Why is this interesting? So I saw beautifully in the Be'er Yosef, or Rabbi Yosef Salant, takes this a little bit deeper and connects it, I think, to what happened, to the Perush that we saw before of Rabbeinu Nissim and the Malbim, about why Avram asked Eliezer to go back to Aram Naharaim to look for somebody of Chesed. So he just found a Rivka, and he attested her about Chesed, and she passed the test with flying colors. And then he gives her these gifts, right? So one of the Shnei Tzimidim, says the Be'er Yosef, the Shnei Tzimidim are two luchos. Why was the Torah given in two luchos? Why couldn't it be given on one luach? And the answer is because there's a clear difference between Ben Odom L'Mokom and Ben Odom L'Chaveiro. That we have a dual level of Torah. One is the way we relate to God, that we live Shavisi Hashem Memegdi Samad in God's world. And the other is that we are generous and kind and sensitive to other people and don't damage other people. The second five luch of the Dibros on the second luach. He wanted to teach us, says the Be'er Yosef, here comes the vort, which is a beautiful vort. He wanted to teach her that it's Shnei Tzimidim. So the word tzamud is a very powerful word in Hebrew. It means two things are linked to each other, that you can't have one without the other. So he was really saying to her, you are being chosen because you have these tremendous qualities of chesed ben adam lachaveiro, but you should know that this is only half the story. Only half of the Torah is ben adam lachaveiro. You should know there is another half, which is ben adam lamokom, the other five. The first five of the Ten Commandments connect us to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And these two have to be Shnei Tzimidim. They have to be linked together. Similarly, he says, the Nezem, Beka, Gogor, the nose ring, of which weighed one Beka, he says, in the symbolism of Chazal, we find the Ta'am and Reyach also symbolize. The Ta'am represents our relationship to God, is the Torah, and the Reyach represents Ben Odom L'Chaveiro, the Masim Tovim, the way we relate to other people and help them and engage in Chesed and Tzedakah. That is the Reyach. So he was saying to her, you should know I'm giving you a nose ring, and the nose ring because you have the Reyach, the Koach HaReyach of Ben Odom L'Chaveiro, but it's only Beka Mishkolo. It's only a Chatzi Shekel. It's only half the story. The other half is the Ben Odom L'Mokoim, the Emunah and Yirat Shamayim, and the living a life of Kiddush Hashem, which is the other side of the story. So here we find, to sum up, a very beautiful story with many, many details in it. One of the beautiful accounts of how Yitzchak found Rivka, and it's only in the last Parshat 67, that Yitzchak and Rivka get together and get married. But the lead up to it is that Avram understood that even though there are the people of his family were over the Avodah Zarah, he had to, in some way, in this chapter, he did a, so to speak, lech lecho in reverse. He had to go back to where he came from to find people of good midot, good personal qualities. And then he could educate them into a life of emunah and of chesed, and then she could become a worthy successor to Sarah Imenu and help build up Klal Yisrael. And in that way, we can see from the Others the importance they ascribed to the quality of chesed, the quality of kindness to all others. But at the same time, understand that it's Shnei Tzimidim. It has to be tzamud to a life of emunah and a life of keeping those mitzvot which connect us bein Adam lemokom to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that is the secret combination of the Avram and Yitzchak, which we see in this week's Parsha, V'chein Yirot.